All right, today we're jumping into a case brief on Alyeska Pipeline versus Aurora Air Services. And this one really boils down to a fascinating question. When does using a right you have in a contract stop being a smart business move and start being an illegal act of malice?
And that's really the heart of it, right? This is the core conflict in Alyeska. It makes us ask, does having a clause in a contract basically give you a free pass to act in bad faith? Let's dive in and see how the court unraveled this exact problem.
So, to really get a handle on how the court thought this through, we're going to break it down using that classic FI Iraq framework. We'll hit the facts, the issue, the rule, the analysis, and the conclusion. And then we'll wrap it all up with the single most important takeaway. Okay, let's get into it. First things first, the facts. To really understand the court's logic, you've got to know who the players were and the chain of events that landed them in court. So let's set the scene. So you've got three main players. Alyeska, the big pipeline company, hires RCA. Then RCA subcontracts with a smaller company, Aurora Air, to handle flights. Now at the same time, Alyeska and Aurora get into a completely separate fight over money, and things get tense. And what happens next? Alyeska decides it's going to handle its own air transport and tells RCA, hey, you need to cut ties with Aurora. The timing here is just absolutely crucial to the whole story. And this right here is Alyeska's defense in a nutshell. They just point to this line in their contract with RCA and say, look, we had the right to change the work. Taking over the flights was just us exercising a right we already had. And, on the surface, that sounds like a pretty solid argument. Okay, so with those facts locked in, we can really sharpen our focus. What's the precise legal question the court has to answer here? This is where we boil everything down to a single critical point of conflict. This is it. This is the whole ballgame. Does that clause in Alyeska's contract act like a shield, giving them the privilege to do whatever they want, no matter the reason? Or can the court actually peek behind that contractual right and ask why they did it? That is the central question of this entire case. Now, to answer that big question, the court doesn't just invent a new rule. It goes back to the established law for what's called intentional interference with a contract. So let's take a look at what that rule actually is. So there's the black letter law. And the two words that this entire case turns on are sitting right there at the end, without justification. Alyeska says they had justification. Aurora says no way. And to really hammer this point home, the court pulls a quote from Prosser, one of the absolute giants of tort law. And what Prosser says is that the motive matters. The court shouldn't just look at what Alyeska did, but it needs to examine the predominant purpose for why they did it. And this chart just lays out the distinction perfectly, doesn't it? Was Alyeska acting in good faith to protect its business? Maybe for legitimate economic reasons? Or was this all just payback, acting out of spite because of that other money dispute they had with Aurora? That is the question at the very heart of the legal rule. All right, now for my favorite part, the analysis. Let's see how the court takes that rule and applies it directly to what Alyeska did. This is where we really see the legal method in action, connecting the law to the messy real world. So Alyeska puts its defense on the table. It's simple, it's direct. They're basically saying, hey, the contract gave us the right. That right creates a privilege, which means we were justified. End of story. But the court immediately hits the brakes. It challenges that whole idea, asking, wait a minute, is that privilege really absolute? And there it is, the knockout punch. The court says, absolutely not. They flat out reject the idea that you can just hide behind a contract clause if your reason for using it is rotten. The right might get you in the door, but it won't protect you if you're there for the wrong reasons. Then the court clarifies who has to prove what, which is super important. All Aurora had to do was show that Alyeska intentionally made RCA breach the contract. Once they did that, the burden of proof actually shifted over to Alyeska to prove they were justified. And because motive is part of that justification, it was Alyeska's job to prove their intentions were good, not Aurora's job to prove they were bad.
So after that detailed breakdown of the rule and who had to prove what, where did the court finally land? Let's look at how this all wraps up.
Well, the court reached a clear conclusion. They affirmed the original judgment against Alyeska. They basically said, look, figuring out Alyeska's real motive, was it business or was it personal, that's a question of fact, and that's a job for a jury. The jury heard all the evidence, and they decided Alyeska had acted out of malice. So the verdict stood. We've walked through the whole case. So what's the big picture here? What's the one crucial principle this decision adds to our understanding of contracts and business torts? If you remember just one thing from this case, let it be this. Having a right in a contract does not give you a license to be a bad actor. If your main reason, your predominant purpose, for exercising that right is just to hurt someone else, you can still be held liable. Good faith always matters. And that's what's so interesting. This case gives us the rule, but applying it is the real challenge. It leaves us with this huge question for anyone practicing law. How would you actually go about proving that an opponent's purpose was malicious? What emails, what internal memos, what testimony would you need to find to show that an action that looks perfectly fine on the surface was actually driven by spite? That's the challenge Alyeska leaves us with.